Hey everybody, we're a couple of meeple, and today we have an oldie but a goodie.
Spoilers!
Okay, in honor of Canada Day last weekend, we're going to review Wilderness War from GMT Games, because let's be honest, Canada would not exist if Britain hadn't successfully sieged and destroyed Louisbourg in 1758.
This is true. We love Canadians, by the way.
I love Canadians.
Anyway, let's get right into it.
Yes, so Wilderness War is a strategic card-driven game set in 1750s North America that tells the story of the French and Indian War.
Stick with us, folks. I know this sounds really historical and like history and things.
And boring, potentially.
But it's not.
It's not. And we're going to tell you why. One player is going to play as the French, and one player is going to play as the British in this conflict that took place before the American Revolution. And depending on the scenario, victory is going to be reached either by points at the end of whatever the turn limit for the scenario you're playing is, so whoever has victory points will win, or by controlling specific spaces on the map when the game ends after a certain number of turns.
And like typical card-driven games, cards can be played for either the event if they match your faction, or they can be used for ops to command soldiers or build fortifications or that kind of thing.
Yeah, and one specific note here that sort of makes this card-driven game different from something like Twilight Struggle is that, like you said, you can only play the card for the event if it matches your faction. If
right,
it's an
and
event.
so if you play a card and it doesn't have your faction on it, it doesn't mean that it keys off your opponent's event, kind of like in Twilight Struggle. I think that means that the other player's event happens anyway. The other player's event does not happen if it's not your faction. You just get it for the points.
Correct. Players are going to use the cards, if they play them for ops, to move their troops and generals and commanders on a point-to-point map of the eastern United States and Canada. They're going to be attacking and maneuvering in the hopes of earning points through combat with their opponent, raiding settlements, or capturing stockades, forts, and fortifications, which are worth various victory points. Mm-hmm. There are multiple scenarios with different start and end dates in terms of historical reference. So you get a nice mix of like stuff that actually happened, the war as it was actually played and started and ended, and a couple of what-if scenarios, like what if the French and Indian War had continued longer than it did actually, and you can play that out and see who would win.
And similar to that, there's also different troop types, and those also tie the theme into the mechanics a little bit more. So there's drilled troops.
Those are square.
And they need, and I cannot say this word because it's French.
Yeah, so drilled troops are square. There's a whole movement system based around how the troops move, because the game is called Wilderness War, and there's a reason for that, and that's because in this war, historically, the terrain of an undeveloped North America played a huge part in how battles were fought, how the two sides approached battle and strategy, and so the game is attempting to recapture that sort of limitations on movement and limitations on how you can get, soldiers from one place to another, and what the various objectives and aims of the French and British were, and how they were different and how they were the same from each other. So the whole game is based around this idea that North America is this undeveloped frontier, and that moving through that frontier can be difficult at times. And so you've got your drilled troops, which are square, and you've got your irregulars, which are coureurs de bois or rangers.
That was the word that I couldn't say. Coureurs de bois.
Coureurs de bois.
I'm too southern to speak French.
Runners of the woods, yes. And so you've got two types of pieces. You've got your squared pieces and your round pieces, and the board has square spaces and round spaces. And so based on what kind of piece you're using, that's how you move through certain parts of the board either more effectively or less effectively, which is, a really interesting layer to what is an established genre in the card-driven strategy game.
There's a lot of cards actually that play off of that too. So if you have auxiliary troops or not, then different effects can happen. So
yeah,
it really matters who you have with you.
Native Americans play a big role in the game. They're called Indians. They can be used for certain things. They have special abilities. They know the land. They can be allied with you. They can be enemies against you. And so it's really, the whole game is trying to capture this feel of, the late 1750s and how the British and the French were fighting each other over the course of several years.
Somewhat ineffectively.
Mostly ineffectively.
Mostly ineffectively.
in sort of the New World, which is a great premise for a game. So we're not going to give you all the rules because it's a fairly involved game in terms of specifics as you're playing, what is doable and what is not doable, but I think we've given you a pretty good overview of what Wilderness War is about, and you know, the main mechanic is this card-driven game mechanic that we've talked about so much on this channel that you'll find in things, or similar to what you'll find in things like Twilight Struggle, 1989, We the People, etc., Paths of Glory, Hannibal.
1955.
1955, which is another review we did recently. That's a card-driven game.
Yeah. So, I think we've given the basics. Do you want to just get right into it?
Yeah, so this is, first of all, this is a really fun game to review for me, especially because I'm right now down a rabbit hole of historical war games.
Guys,
so deep.
You guys don't even know. Like, I don't think there's any coming back from this.
No, there's not. You should go check out our Facebook page, which I will link here, but it's also linked on our channel. I'll post some pictures of sort of what my office looks like right now.
Yeah.
In terms of the historical war game situation that I'm in.
He loves war games so much right now that he actually
historical war games.
Okay, he loves historical card-driven war games specifically so much right now that in addition to us doing this full review for Wilderness War, he had a side solo game of Labyrinth going on.
I did from the same designer,
which he might actually post a video on soon too. So
potentially,
we'll see how that goes. But
I'm experimenting with this whole one-player thing.
He's obsessed.
I really am. Wilderness War caught my attention because it's designed by a guy named Volko Runke, who is now...
Great name, by the way.
Yeah.
He's destined to be a board game designer.
He actually works for the CIA.
Dude is awesome.
He is awesome.
I'm putting him on my Christmas card list. Is he Christian?
I have no idea. I've never met the man.
I'm just going to say happy holidays then.
Okay.
Send him a big old snowman. Be like, dude, you rock.
He, more recently has designed... He's very popular right now. He has designed a series of games for GMT called the Coin series, which are... If you watched our 2013 year in review, you'll know that my number one game of 2013 was a game in the Coin series. So he's a designer that right now he's my favorite designer, and he just makes such amazing games by blending genres and has a really good sense of design for history and mechanics.
Right.
So he can convey history and political situations through his game mechanics in a way that I have never seen anyone be able to do. Which is
brilliant.
Yeah. And so Wilderness War was his first game for GMT. It's one of his earliest games, if not his earliest game. And, because it's his earliest game, it's less sort of out there than his more recent stuff. It adheres really closely to the strategic card-driven war game conventions that you've had in games of the past that we've already mentioned. So it's not necessarily breaking new ground mechanically in that sense, but like all of his games, he has just a style, and he has a way of designing specific mechanics that are in his games that reflect the time period. So we talked about how troops, moving through the wilderness have trouble depending on what kind of troop they are, or know the country and can move better if they're not, if they're familiar with the countryside. So it's stuff like that he's put into this game that reflects the history, reflects the sort of types of combat that were found historically in the French and Indian War. There's a lot of sieges. Historically. You'll get a lot of sieges in this game. Very little open combat, because the terrain is so severe. It's a lot of movement is mostly by river and water and lakes and movement because US hadn't been developed yet. It was mostly woods and mountains, so it's tough to move through that. So the whole game sort of reflects his and shows how he designs to the history and the conflict that he's designing for. So I just wanted to say that because he is one of my favorite designers, and you should check out not only this game but some of his other games as well.
So maybe if there's a time period in history or a certain conflict that you want to learn more about or that already interests you, then there's probably a game for it. And I just want to say that as someone who is not as into history as other people are, when you started going down this path of card-driven historical war games, I was like, oh god, here we go. But I will say, playing these games, and especially Wilderness War, I've gained an appreciation for history in a way that I don't think anyone has ever imparted on me before. If I had learned about the French and Indian War by playing Wilderness War in high school, it would have stuck with me so much more. The names of the generals, the kinds of problems they faced, just because you get a sense of that through gameplay and through playing through the different scenarios and reading about them, that you don't get from a history book, Like, they kind of bullet out the points. You learn dates, you learn battles, and you learn generals, but it's all facts, and it doesn't really, like, stick with you as a story. And what I love most about these games is that despite being a little bit turned off at first about it being a history game, or a game about historical events, it actually does really do a great job of telling a great story. And the mechanics are incredibly well thought out and perfect for the kind of stuff they were going through. So I really appreciate that too, despite not being a huge fan of history.
One of us. One of us. One of us.
No.
So I just want a couple other things I really like about the game. The map is gorgeous. It's easy to read, but it's also beautiful, and I really like the contrast between the units, the French being blue and the British being red, and the map being basically green. It just provides a nice contrast on the table. It's really enjoyable to play. I love point-to-point games. I don't know what it is, but like, you tell me that you have a CDG with point-to-point movement, and I'm like rustling in the loins. I'm like, give me that.
Oh, babe, dude, TMI.
But yeah, the cards are also very beautiful. I really love, a lot of card-driven games that cover conflicts in the modern era have actual images and photographs. Twilight Struggle has actual pictures from the era. Labyrinth, which is one of Volko's other games, that tackles the War on Terror in the 2000s decade, has actual pictures of real events and real people. And in this game, obviously, there's no photography, so it's all art. It's all sort of like period art and sort of depicting the events on the cards, the people on the cards, and I really enjoy the art in this game. I think it adds a lot of flavor, not only on the cards, but also the counters. I mean, the counters are really nicely illustrated, especially the commanders. They have like pictures of like dapper-looking British gents and French rangers and all sorts of stuff. So it's a really beautifully produced game, and I would expect nothing less from GMT.
So one thing that I really want to get across, aside from just appreciating the history after playing it, is that I'm not a type of person who gravitates towards these kind of games. Like, I was very skeptical of Twilight Struggle, despite it getting amazing reviews, because it just seems like it's going to be very complicated and very thinky. And so this one, even after having played Twilight Struggle and Labyrinth and the Coin series, like, whenever you come to me with a new game that you've bought because it's a card-driven historical war game, I am skeptical to try it because I'm worried that I'm gonna have to, like, think too much. And I know that it makes me sound completely, like, airheaded and, like, awful, but, like, when I think about playing board games, I want to, like, have a good time, and I want to have a story come out of it, and I really, like, theme means a lot to me. But I'm always so glad when you do bring to me a game that you think I will like, and Wilderness Moor is one of them. Because he just fist pumped. You guys didn't even see it. It was amazing. Because you get that story out of it, and also because it's not as complicated as I think I psych myself up to think that it will be. Like, once you get the basic rules down, which we'll talk about we'll talk about how complicated or not complicated they can be, but once you get the basic rules down of what you are able to do each turn, it's really about the cards that you get. It's all card management. And so turn to turn, round to round, like, you have a hand of cards that you're dealt, and you have to make the best decisions with those cards. And so once I started thinking about it in terms of, like, playing hand to hand rather than, like, this crazy thing where I have to have this amazing end goal, then it got a little bit more manageable for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And, there's enough variety with those cards that you're constantly having to adapt on the fly. So it's a very tactical experience, in addition to being a strategic experience of long-term goals that you're trying to achieve. Right.
I think when people play games, they don't like to feel stupid. And I think one reason that I am a little turned off by these games, which maybe I'm not going to be turned off anymore now that we've played a few of them, but I feel like I can make a mistake and it's going to be fine. That there's enough variety in those cards that you can turn it around, or if your, like, opponent makes some crazy move, then there's going to be options for you to combat that or fix that.
Yeah, and the other thing that's cool that I really like is that, the games are always close. Every game that we've played of this has been extremely close. I've won by 1 point. Like, I literally had 1 point at the end of the game, and I managed to win that way.
Yeah, or this last one, I just needed to hang on to this one fortification by the end of the turn, and I think it was the very last die roll of the last hand where you took it away from me, and so that ended the game.
Which is good and bad.
Good and bad. Yeah, I will say that, like, one of my pros/cons is that sometimes it can be up to a die roll. Pros because it's that close, even if you feel like you don't really have a grasp on what's going on. A con because it can come down to a die roll.
Yeah, and so we'll talk about the cons. I just want to say a few more things quickly. The game is very deep. It's accessible on the surface once you kind of get the rules down. The mechanics are really satisfying. The game tells just amazing stories. Every single time we've played, it's been different, and there's been a different story. I remember one game we played, the very first combat of the very first hand of cards, you killed one of my leaders, so I didn't have him for the rest of the game, which was huge. I really like the different unit types. I love the fact that the board remains uncrowded because you've got, the only pieces on the board basically are your generals and your commanders, and they each have a box somewhere on the map that you can put all their troops that they're commanding. So it keeps the map very clean and very easy to read and very easy to play with, which is nice. And I just love, so much about this game. It's just fantastic. But there are some downsides. Like you said, the die roll coming down to potentially coming down to a die roll at the end, can heartbreak it for you.
Yeah.
I think that, I talked about how much I love Volko Ruhnke as a designer, but, he does have a couple negative things that appear in all of his games that I'm still having trouble tackling, and that is because of the way he designs games to fit the historical period, he has to come up with all these systems that have a lot of tiny rules exceptions in certain situations, and sort of committing those to memory is very difficult. And in this game especially, there's a lot of contradictory rules that resolve one way if such and such is true, and resolve another way if such and such is not true. And to remember all of that is very difficult.
It's near impossible, I think. I mean, unless we play this all the time, every weekend, faithfully. But, like, usually what we end up doing is just passing the rule book back and forth, and at the start of your turn, making sure that, like, the thing you have mapped out is actually something you can execute and be within the rules. Yeah.
And I would say that, the first time you play, I would say you're going to definitely need the rule book, and you are going to make mistakes, a lot of them, and you're just going to need to accept that. But the more you play, the more you'll sort of catch those things. But it's important that you read the rule book twice, probably. I would say twice. Once before you've played, then you've tried playing and made some mistakes, then go back and read the rule book, and then you're going to figure out, like, what you did wrong and how to fix that. So that, that's a downside to me, because I feel like they could be a little clearer, or, he should err a little more on the side of simplicity when he's designing things. But I understand why he has certain things in there. But there's just so many things with, being in supply. Retreating with drilled troops is different than retreating with not drilled troops. And
what happens at the end of a year?
Winter attrition, how many units you can have in a fortress and stuff like that. So
step losses and all this stuff.
Yeah, it's a lot for the brain to absorb if you play a lot of games, and even if you don't, it's a lot to absorb. So, he's gotten a little better about that, but he still has that a lot in his other games, and this one is especially, this criticism is especially poignant in this particular game.
But with that said, I think what we're trying to get across is that despite all those flaws, I would say that it's still worth putting in the time if you appreciate history at all, because I do appreciate history. It's just there's certain, like, historical moments that I don't know much about, and I really do appreciate this game.
Even if you don't appreciate history, these types of games could make you appreciate them.
Exactly. Exactly. That's what I'm trying to get across.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
A couple other things to be sort of to know about, if you're all ready to click the buy now button on Amazon. The game is long. Even with the short scenario, your first time is probably going to take you 4 hours to play through it. As you get the rules down, it's a 2 to 3 hour game with the short scenario, but you can play long scenarios. Like, we played a long scenario that starts in 1755 and goes all the way through 1759, and that took us the better part of a week to finish in, like, 3 different sessions of a couple hours each. And if you play
about like 6 to 7 hours, I think, total.
If you play the full campaign game, which is 1755 to 1762, which features, like, the what if the war had continued past 1759, that you're looking at, a substantial investment.
Yeah.
But I think on the opposite side of that, it's also a positive that you get a lot of game in here if you want it.
And it's really epic. Like, turn to turn, there's stuff that happens that's funny. Like, we laugh a lot in our sessions. There's stuff that's, like, shocking. Like, oh my god, I can't believe, like, this Native American went down to, like, raid your village and he killed himself. That sucks. Like, I don't have him the rest of the game. Like, you know what I mean? Smallpox can happen. That's really epic.
So along those lines, I mean, we wanted to tell the story of our game as well. So if you're still with us now, please look for a video on our channel coming up in the next couple of days. It's going to be something new for us, and it's going to be something a little different than what you're used to so far. And that is, we did a live session report of this game as we played it, with private confessionals and gameplay and, our running thoughts as we played through this game. So, we want you to look forward to that because, it was something that we had wanted to do for a long time, and we finally put it together with a game where it makes sense.
Right, and we really wanted to get across, because this game is so hard to explain, like, those moments that you get turn to turn and with each hand of cards. We really wanted to, like, get across, like, the fact that you're given this hand of cards, you have this plan when you first get them, and then once you get into gameplay, you have no idea what your opponent has or what they have planned. And so you kind of have to adapt as you go. But you do get those funny moments where you're like, I'm going to play this card and he's going to hate it. And it's going to be great. So I think we did we've looked at some of the footage already. It looks pretty great. So I think it'll be pretty funny.
So with all that said, what is your ultimate verdict decision on this game? What do you give it out of 2, first of all?
What's our little symbol that we're doing? 2 out of...
Well, 2? I'm personally going to give it 2 coureurs de bois out of 2, or as the French would say, 2 coureurs de bois out of 2 coureurs.
We're in America. Though I'm playing as a British player. Let's see.
Dapper Gentleman?
Can I do a different one? Do I have to say coureurs de
bois?
bois?
No, you could do whatever you want.
Okay, I'm going to say 2 Dapper Gentlemen out of 2 Dapper Gentlemen, which is really high for me because I don't usually gravitate towards historical games, so I hope those of you watching understand where I'm coming from, and that's a big deal. This is
her giving her full stamp of approval to a game set in colonial history with some complex mechanics.
Card-driven game, yeah.
From GMT.
Yeah, this is serious.
I think we've made a breakthrough here today.
Sure, I guess so.
Anyways, we hope you enjoyed, and make sure you stay tuned to the channel for another video about Wilderness War that's going to be completely different than I think anything you've seen so far on the channel.
Yep, we're really stoked to see what you guys think of that format, so let us know.
Thank you very much.
Yep.